The pen trembled in Frederick's hand as he prepared to sign the final divorce papers. 15 seconds. That was all it took to end 11 years of a marriage he had thought perfect. The registry office had that characteristic smell of old paper and reheated coffee, and the silence was broken only by the discreet hum of the air conditioning. Frederick looked once more at Mary's signature already recorded on the previous page, that elegant cursive script he knew so well, or thought he knew. The notary adjusted her glasses and offered a professional smile, one she must have practiced 1,000 times for couples reaching their end. Frederick took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. At 42, he had built a tech empire valued at £80 million. He had offices in London, Manchester, and Birmingham. He commanded a team of 300 employees, but there, in that carpeted room on the 10th floor of a commercial building on Oxford Street, he felt small and lost. The door burst open with a bang that made the notary jump in her chair. Frederick turned his head, expecting to see perhaps his lawyer with some forgotten document, but it wasn't the lawyer. It was Mrs. Celia. Mrs. Celia was 63 years old and had cleaned Frederick's office for a decade. Always discreet, always punctual, always with that soft scent of lavender that came from some sachet she carried in the pocket of her blue uniform. Frederick saw her almost every day, but rarely exchanged more than a good morning and a goodbye. She was part of the office landscape, like the ornamental plants or the abstract paintings in the reception area. But at that moment, Mrs. Celia was not a discreet presence. She was panting, her face flushed from climbing the stairs because apparently she hadn't waited for the elevator. In her hands, she held a yellow plastic folder, one of those cheap ones you buy at a stationery store, and in her eyes Frederick saw something he had never seen before, an almost desperate urgency. "Dr. Frederick, you cannot sign those papers," she said, her voice coming out in short bursts between breaths. "Please, you need to see this first." The notary frowned. "Excuse me, madam, but this is a private session and—" I know. Forgive the intrusion," Mrs. Celia interrupted, something completely out of her usual character. "But this cannot wait. Dr. Frederick, you've known me for 10 years. I've never meddled where I shouldn't. But this—" she held up the yellow folder. "This changes everything." Frederick felt something strange in his stomach, a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Part of him wanted to send Mrs. Celia away, finish it quickly, and move on with his life. Another part, a smaller but more insistent part, wanted to know what was in that folder. "Celia, I don't know what you think." "Your wife is not who you think she is," Mrs. Celia said, and the words fell into the room like stones in a still lake. "Mary has another life, other lives, to be exact." The world seemed to slow down. Frederick looked at the notary, who had an expression between embarrassed and fascinated. He looked at the pen still suspended over the paper. He looked again at Mrs. Celia. "What do you mean, other lives?" Mrs. Celia approached and placed the folder on the table next to the divorce documents. "May I show you?" Frederick nodded, unable to form words. The notary also leaned in, apparently forgetting all her professional composure. Mrs. Celia opened the folder and began to pull out photographs. The first photo showed Mary in a square Frederick didn't recognize. She was sitting on a bench next to a man who was definitely not Frederick. Between them were 2 children, a girl about 8 years old and a younger boy. All smiled at the camera in a typical family pose. "This proves nothing," Frederick heard his own voice say, even as his brain tried to process the image. "It could be a cousin, a friend, I don't know." "It could be," Mrs. Celia agreed, pulling out another photo. "But what about this?" The second photo was even more disturbing. Mary was in a large, bright kitchen, wearing a floral apron Frederick had never seen. She was holding a cake pan, and in the background were birthday decorations. A different man from the first was hugging her around the waist, and there, clinging to her leg, a little boy of about 4 years old looked at the camera with big, curious eyes. Frederick felt the room spin a little. "Where did you get these photos?" "I hired someone, doctor," Mrs. Celia said, and there was guilt in her voice. "I used my savings. I know it wasn't my place, but I couldn't let you sign those papers without knowing the truth." "But why?" Frederick finally let go of the pen. Why would you do this? Mrs. Celia pulled up a chair and sat down, as if her legs could no longer support her. Because I saw things, Doctor. Things that didn't make sense. 3 months ago, when I was cleaning the closet, I found a school document that had fallen out of Mrs. Mary's bag. It was a registration form for a girl. The photo was of her when she was little. I recognized her by her eyes. But the name wasn't Mary. It was Anna Paulina. And the address was in a city 400 kilometers from here. Frederick ran a hand over his face. That's impossible. Mary and we tried to have children. She couldn't. She was infertile. We had tests, consulted doctors. I know, Doctor. That's why I found it strange. Mrs. Celia pulled more documents from the folder. Then I started paying more attention. Her trips. Do you remember how many times she traveled for volunteer work? Frederick remembered. Mary was dedicated to social causes. She traveled at least twice a month to different cities, working with NGOs, organizing charity events. It was one of the things he most admired about her. Her generosity, her dedication to others. So, I started noting the dates, Mrs. Celia continued, and I noticed a pattern. She would stay here for 10 days, then 5 days away. Then she'd come back for a week and leave again for 5 or 6 days. It was like clockwork, Doctor, too precise to be random. The notary finally found her voice. Madam, these are very serious accusations. Are you sure you want to continue with this here? Perhaps it would be better. I want to hear, Frederick said, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. Celia, tell me everything. Mrs. Celia nodded and pulled out a sheet with handwritten notes. I spoke with a friend of mine who works at a registry office in Edinburgh. I asked some discreet questions, sent Mrs. Mary's photo, and she found records, marriage records, one in Edinburgh in the name of Anna Paulina Foster, another in Bristol in the name of Mary Paulina Fernandez. But that's a crime, Frederick murmured. She would be arrested. She would be if someone had cross-referenced the information, Mrs. Celia explained. But she used variations of her own name and real documents. Apparently there are loopholes in the system, and she knew those loopholes very well. Frederick picked up the photos again, studying every detail. Mary was radiant in both, happy, complete. How did she manage it? How could one person live 3 completely separate lives? There's more, Mrs. Celia said softly, taking the last envelope from the folder. The investigator I hired discovered financial movements. She was embezzling money, Doctor. Small amounts from each account, from each husband, accumulating it in an offshore account. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Frederick looked at the divorce papers, still awaiting his signature. Mary had asked for the separation 2 months ago, saying she needed to find herself, that she wasn't happy, that she needed space. He had accepted, though he didn't understand. He had offered couples therapy, holidays, anything. But she was inflexible. She wanted the divorce, and she wanted it fast. Now he understood why. Where is she now? Frederick asked. According to her schedule, she should be in Bristol until tomorrow, Mrs. Celia replied, with husband number 3 and their son. Frederick stood up, his legs shaky but determined. He looked at the notary. I need to postpone this. Sir, the other party has already signed. You have the right to sign or not, but I won't sign today, Frederick said firmly. I need time to process this. I need answers. The notary sighed but nodded. Very well. I will record the postponement, but you have 48 hours to return, or the process will need to be restarted. Frederick barely heard. He was already picking up the yellow folder, carefully putting away the photos and documents. Mrs. Celia also stood up. Concern etched on her face. Doctor, what are you going to do? Frederick looked at her. This woman he had seen almost every day for 10 years, but never truly seen. This woman who had used her savings, who had taken risks, who had arrived panting in that room to save him from signing away his life without knowing the full truth. First, I'm going to thank you for this, he said, and saw her eyes fill with tears. And then I'm going to find out the whole truth, who is really the woman I shared my life with for 11 years. Frederick couldn't sleep that night. Sitting in the leather armchair of his home office, he reviewed every photo, every document, every note Mrs. Celia had gathered in the yellow folder. The light from the desk lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and the clock struck 3 in the morning when he finally picked up the phone. He didn't call Mary. That would be premature. Instead, he dialed the number of Richard Allen, his best friend since college, and now one of London's most respected lawyers. Richard answered on the 5th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Frederick? It's 3 in the morning, man. Did someone die?" "My marriage," Frederick replied, and heard his friend wake up immediately on the other end of the line. 2 hours later, Richard was sitting in the same office, a cup of strong coffee in his hand, looking at the documents spread across the table. He moved from one photo to another, from the private investigator's report to Mrs. Celia's notes, and his face grew paler and paler. "This is insane," Richard finally said. "Triple bigamy. Frederick, this goes beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of law." "Tell me what to do," Frederick asked, exhaustion weighing in every word. Richard sighed and put down his cup. "Legally? You have grounds to annul the marriage, sue for fraud, embezzlement, misappropriation. She could face up to 8 years in prison, but—" He paused significantly. "There are 5 children involved in this, innocent children whose lives will be destroyed when this comes to light." Frederick felt the weight of those words. 5 children. 5 lives built on lies, but real to them. "What if I don't want to involve the police immediately?" "Then you need more solid evidence and you need to act fast," Richard said, picking up his phone. "I have a contact, a discreet investigator. Former federal police, now works independently. If anyone can map the full extent of this, it's him." The investigator's name was Roger Smith, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and impressive efficiency. By 9 in the morning, he was already in Frederick's office, connecting a laptop to the conference room television. "I spent the night analyzing the material your lawyer sent me," Roger began, his voice deep and controlled. "And I can confirm, your wife, or rather, her versions, maintain 3 active residences, 3 main bank accounts, and an extremely sophisticated network of secondary accounts." On the screen, an organizational chart appeared that made Frederick's stomach churn. In the center, a photo of Mary. Around it, 3 circles representing 3 different identities: Mary Paulina Santos in London, Anna Paulina Foster in Edinburgh, and Mary Paulina Fernandez in Bristol. "How does she manage to maintain this?" Frederick asked, still incredulous. "Military organization and a deep understanding of system loopholes," Roger explained, clicking to the next screen. "She uses legal variations of her own name, authentic documents obtained through different processes at different times. The systems of different states don't communicate efficiently, and she chose strategic cities, far enough apart that the lives wouldn't accidentally intersect." "And the husbands?" Richard asked, leaning forward. Roger brought up photos of the other 2 men. Charles Miller, 45 university professor in Edinburgh, married to Anna Paulina for 9 years, has 2 daughters with her, 8 and 6 years old. A dedicated man, works a lot, travels frequently for academic conferences. The next photo showed a younger man with a serene appearance. Paul Henry Cross, 38, civil engineer in Bristol, married to Mary Paulina for 6 years, has a 4-year-old son, works on projects that frequently keep him out of town for days. Frederick felt a wave of nausea. "She chose busy men on purpose." "Exactly," Roger confirmed. "Successful men, dedicated to their work, who wouldn't ask too many questions about her absences. And look at this." He brought up a financial spreadsheet. "In the last 5 years, she has embezzled approximately £1,800,000, small amounts from each account, disguised as volunteer work expenses, family gifts, home renovations." "1,800,000, Frederick repeated, stunned. "That's long-term planning." "That's preparation for an escape," Roger corrected. "From recent movements, I'd say she was preparing to disappear in the next 6 months, start over in some country without extradition, with an accumulated fortune." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "And she had the audacity to ask for a divorce first. She was going to get away clean with everything." Frederick stood up and walked to the window, watching the city wake up below. Oxford Street was already busy, people rushing to their jobs, living their normal, honest lives. Meanwhile, there in that office, he discovered he had been deceived in a way he never imagined possible. I need to talk to them, Frederick said suddenly. To whom? Richard asked. To the other husbands, Charles and Paul. Frederick turned to face the two men. They deserve to know the truth, and together, we can decide the best way to protect the children from this mess. Frederick, this is risky, Richard warned. They might react badly, they might call the police, they might punch me in the face, and I deserve it for being so blind, Frederick interrupted. But this is bigger than my pride. There are 5 children who are, technically, siblings. There are 3 men who were deceived in the same way. We need to deal with this together. Roger nodded slowly. I can arrange discreet meetings, but you need to be prepared for unpredictable reactions. I'm prepared, Frederick said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. 3 hours later, Frederick was in a rented car driving towards Edinburgh. Roger had managed to get Charles Miller's work address and confirmed he would be alone in his university office that afternoon. The journey from London to Edinburgh would take about 7 hours, and Frederick used every minute to rehearse what he would say. How do you start a conversation like that? Hello, I'm your wife's other husband. I've discovered we're victims of the same fraud. No option seemed adequate. The university campus was quiet when Frederick arrived, close to 6 in the evening. Students walked in small groups, some sitting on the grass with open books. Frederick found the Humanities building and went up to the 3rd floor, where a silent corridor led to Charles Miller's office. The door was ajar. Frederick took a deep breath and knocked lightly. Come in, a tired voice replied. Charles Miller was sitting behind a desk covered with papers and assignments, his glasses resting on the tip of his nose. He looked up and frowned when he saw a stranger. Can I help you? Professor Charles, Frederick began, his mouth dry. My name is Frederick Andrews. I know this will sound completely absurd, but I need to talk to you urgently about something. About Anna Paulina. The change in Charles's face was instantaneous. He took off his glasses and straightened up in his chair. How do you know my wife? Frederick entered the office and closed the door behind him. May I sit down? This will take a few minutes, and I promise every word is true, however impossible it may seem. Charles indicated the chair in front of the desk, his face a mask of concern and confusion. Is she all right? Has something happened to Anna Paulina? She's physically fine, Frederick said, pulling the yellow folder from his backpack. But there's something you need to know, something I only discovered myself yesterday. And then, with a controlled voice but a pounding heart, Frederick began to tell the story. He showed the photos, the documents, the marriage records, the carefully constructed timeline. Each revelation was like a blow, and Frederick could see Charles growing paler, more tense, more incredulous. This is a lie, Charles finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Anna Paulina would never. We have 2 daughters. She's a dedicated mother. She also told me she couldn't have children, Frederick said softly. For years I believed it. We had tests, consulted specialists, all part of the same lie. Charles stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. He walked to the window, his hands trembling. 9 years, he murmured. 9 years of my life, my daughters. My God, my daughters. I know, Frederick said, feeling his own pain reflected in the other man. That's why I'm here. Not to hurt you more, but because we need to decide together how to deal with this, especially thinking about the children. Charles turned, his eyes red. Is there anyone else? A 3rd husband, in Bristol. I already have his address. Frederick paused. I thought we could go together. Face this together. Are you crazy? Charles let out a bitter laugh. You show up here, destroy my life in 15 minutes, and you want me to get in a car with you to destroy some other poor guy's life. I understand your anger, Frederick said, remaining seated, keeping his voice calm. But think about it. If we don't do this the right way, it's going to turn into a circus. Media, police, public scandal. And who will suffer the most? The 5 innocent children who asked for none of this. Charles returned to the desk, picked up one of the photos. It was the image of Mary with her son in Bristol. He studied her face, looking for signs he had missed, clues he should have seen. How did she do it? Charles asked, more to himself than to Frederick. That's one of the questions we need to answer, Frederick said, but not alone. Together we have a better chance of understanding the extent of this and protecting those who need protection. The silence stretched for long minutes. Frederick could hear the clock on the wall ticking each second, each beat of his own heart. Finally, Charles sighed deeply. "Give me tonight," he said. "I need to process this. I need to see my daughters, make sure they're all right. Tomorrow morning we'll go to Bristol." Frederick nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "Is there a hotel nearby where I can stay?" "There's one 3 blocks from here," Charles said, already picking up his coat. "But Frederick," he looked directly into the other man's eyes, "if this is some elaborate scam, if you're lying—" "I wish I were lying," Frederick said sincerely. "Believe me, I'd love to discover that all this is a grotesque misunderstanding. But it's not. And deep down you already know that." Charles left the office without another word, leaving Frederick alone with the weight of the revelations and the uncertainty of what would come next. Frederick woke up in the hotel room with sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. He had slept poorly, waking every hour with confused nightmares where Mary multiplied into infinite versions, each with a different face. The clock showed 6:30 in the morning. He took a quick shower, put on clean clothes he had bought the night before at a convenience store, and went down for breakfast. Charles was already there, sitting at a corner table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were sunken, his beard unshaven, his hands restlessly fiddling with a paper napkin. "I spent the entire night going over every detail of the last 9 years," Charles said as soon as Frederick sat down. "Every trip of hers, every absence, every excuse. And you know what's worse? Everything makes sense now. The pieces fit perfectly, and I feel like a complete idiot for not having seen it before." Frederick poured himself some coffee. "She's good at what she does. This isn't our fault." "My daughters asked why I was crying last night," Charles continued, his voice breaking. "I made up that I was watching a sad movie. They're 8 and 6, Frederick. How am I going to explain this to them one day?" "I don't know yet," Frederick admitted, "but I think together we can find a way to minimize the damage." They hit the road at 7:30. The journey from Edinburgh to Bristol would take about 6 hours. Charles remained silent for the first hour, looking out the window as the English countryside landscape passed by. Frederick respected the silence, lost in his own thoughts. "She cooked every Sunday," Charles said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Anna Paulina made a special lunch, gathered the family. She said those moments were sacred to her. Now I realize they were sacred because they were part of her rotation. Sundays were ours. Tuesdays and Wednesdays must have been yours in London, and the rest—" He let the sentence die. "She organized charity events," Frederick contributed. "At least that's what she said. Traveled constantly, always for a noble cause. I admired that so much about her. Her dedication to others, her generosity. Mine gave extra lessons to underprivileged children," Charles said with a bitter laugh. 3 afternoons a week she left early and came back late. I thought it was wonderful how much she cared about education." The two men exchanged a look of painful understanding. Mary, or Anna Paulina, or whatever her real name was, had built personas that reflected what each husband valued most. For Frederick, the pragmatic businessman, she was the sophisticated wife involved in social causes. For Charles, the university professor, she was the dedicated educator. Each version of her was a carefully polished mirror to reflect each man's values. "Roger, the investigator, said she keeps a diary," Frederick commented after a few more miles. "A record of each identity, each story, each detail. That's how she doesn't get confused. Did you see this diary?" "Not yet, but we'll need to find it. It might contain crucial information about the entire operation." They stopped for lunch at a roadside restaurant near Bath. The food was good, but neither of them had much appetite. Charles pushed the rice around his plate as he talked about his daughters, about how the older one had her mother's same smile, how the younger one was learning to play the guitar. "They're going to need therapy," Charles said suddenly, "when they find out the truth. No matter how we tell them, it will be traumatic." "All 5 children will need it," Frederick agreed. "Maybe we should start thinking about that, find good professionals, set up a fund to ensure they have the necessary support." Charles looked at him in surprise. You're thinking way ahead on this. It's what I do, Frederick said with a small, humorless smile. I plan. I analyze scenarios. I create strategies. Ironically, these are the same skills that completely failed to make me realize my wife had 2 other families. They arrived in Bristol in the mid-afternoon. Roger had sent a business address. Paul Henry Cross worked at a construction company in the south of the city. The building was modern, all glass and steel, with the company logo shining at the top. Frederick and Charles sat in the car for a few minutes, neither wanting to take the next step. Like we did yesterday, Charles finally said. Straight to the point. No beating around the bush. It'll be awful either way, so better to be quick. The receptionist directed them to the 4th floor, where Paul Henry had an office with a view of the city. He was on the phone when they arrived, gesturing as he talked about schedules and budgets. Seeing 2 strangers standing at the door, he quickly ended the call. "Can I help you?" Paul Henry asked, his gentle accent present. He was younger than Frederick and Charles, with that restless energy of someone always thinking about 3 things at once. "Mr. Paul?" Frederick began, using the same direct tone that had worked with Charles. "My name is Frederick Andrews. This is Charles Miller. We need to talk to you about Mary Paulina, your wife." Paul Henry frowned. "Mary? Is she all right? Has something happened?" "Can we come in and close the door?" Charles asked. "What we have to say is delicate." 15 minutes later, Paul Henry was sitting on the floor of his own office, his back against the wall, looking at the ceiling as if searching for answers there. The photos and documents were spread across the table, irrefutable evidence of a reality he didn't want to accept. 6 years, Paul murmured. 6 years believing I had found the perfect woman, that I had built a family, that my son— His voice trailed off. "My son has siblings he doesn't know." Frederick knelt beside him. "I know how you're feeling. We went through this yesterday and today. It's devastating. But we need to keep our heads for the sake of the children." "The children," Paul repeated, as if the words were foreign. "My son is 4 years old. He loves his mother. How do I protect him from this?" "Together," Charles said, sitting on the other side of Paul. "That's why we're here. Alone, each of us would make rash decisions, driven by anger or despair, but together we can think clearly. We can create a plan that protects the children above all else." Paul looked at the 2 men, these strangers who suddenly shared the strangest and most painful connection possible. "You don't hate me for being with her too?" "We are victims of the same fraud," Frederick said firmly. "You didn't choose this. I didn't choose this. Charles didn't choose this. She chose us. She manipulated us. It's not our fault." Paul ran his hands over his face. "I need to see my son. I need to make sure he's okay." "Where is Mary now?" Charles asked. "She traveled yesterday for a wellness retreat," Paul said. And there was bitter irony in his voice. "Or at least that's what she told me. She's probably in London or Edinburgh with one of you." Frederick checked his phone. According to her schedule that Roger managed to access, she should be returning to London tonight. There's a charity event tomorrow she can't miss. "Then we have time," Charles said, his mind already working on the problem. "Time to plan how we're going to confront her, because we are going to confront her. Right?" "Absolutely," Frederick confirmed, "but with strategy. She's intelligent, manipulative. If we go in disorganized, she'll find a way to turn the situation around." Paul stood up, regaining some composure. "Right, so let's do this properly. Let's go to my house. We can talk there without interruptions. And we're going to find out exactly who this woman is who deceived us all." Paul's house was cozy, in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. When they entered, they were greeted by a woman in her 60s, holding a little boy by the hand. The boy had big, curious eyes, and when he saw Paul, he ran to hug him. "Daddy!" Frederick felt something tighten in his chest seeing Paul pick up his son. This child, these 5 children, were innocent in all of this. They had been conceived, loved, and raised within lies, but for them it was real. That was their father. Those were their homes. Those were their lives. "Luke, these are some of Daddy's friends," Paul said, his voice firm despite the evident emotion. Mrs. Mary, could you take Luke to play in the backyard? We need to talk about work. The woman, whom Frederick assumed was a nanny or housekeeper, nodded and took the boy outside. As soon as they were alone, the three men sat around the dining table. First, we need to understand her plan, Frederick began, pulling out a notepad. Roger discovered she was accumulating money in an offshore account, nearly £2 million. This isn't impulsive, it's calculated. She was going to disappear, Paul said, the realization hitting him. She was going to collect the money and just vanish. And leave us to pick up the pieces, Charles completed. 3 confused men, 5 children without a mother, and probably not a penny of what she stole. Frederick nodded. So our number 1 priority, recover the money. Not for us, but for the children. They'll need education, therapy, support. That money should go to them. Second, Charles continued, picking up the pace, we need to decide on the legal issue. She committed serious crimes, bigamy, fraud, embezzlement. She could face years in prison. But if we prosecute her criminally, Paul interjected, it becomes news, media, scandal. Everyone will know. And the children will carry that for the rest of their lives. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the central question, the dilemma with no easy answer. Justice versus protection. Punishment versus privacy. What if we give her an ultimatum? Frederick suggested. We confront her together, show her that we know everything. We demand that she return every penny, sign away any rights to our assets, and agree to leave our lives and the children's lives permanently. In return, we don't involve the police immediately. She might just flee anyway, Paul pointed out. That's why we need to have all the evidence organized and registered with a notary, Charles said. A formal confession from her acknowledging everything. If she flees or breaks the agreement, then we involve the authorities. Frederick looked at the 2 men. Are you comfortable with this? Letting her go without immediate legal punishment? Charles sighed deeply. No, but I'm more concerned about my daughters than about revenge. If we can protect them from the scandal and secure their financial future, I can live with that. Me too, Paul agreed. My son doesn't deserve to have his childhood destroyed because of his mother's crimes. If we can minimize the damage for him, it's worth it. Then it's decided, Frederick said, feeling a renewed determination. Tomorrow, when she returns to London, we'll be there waiting. All 3 of us together, and we'll end this charade once and for all. The night was long for the 3 men. Paul insisted that Frederick and Charles stay at his house, saying it would be more practical for planning the next day's confrontation. After Luke went to sleep, they gathered again in the living room, each with a cup of coffee, and began to map out every detail of Mary's operation. Charles had brought his laptop and started creating a timeline. We need to understand how she coordinated everything. The dates, the places, the excuses. There must be a pattern. As they worked, they shared stories, small details that now took on new meaning. Frederick recounted how Mary always insisted on doing the shopping alone, saying she needed time to think. Charles remembered that Anna Paulina had 3 mobile phones, claiming she needed separate numbers for work and volunteering. Paul mentioned that Mary Paulina never wanted to add his friends on social media, saying she preferred to keep her personal life private. She was careful, Paul said, going through the documents. Each lie had a layer of truth, that's why it worked so well. Around midnight, Charles found something. Look at this, he said, turning the laptop to the others. I managed to access her social media using some information Roger provided. She has 3 completely different profiles, but look at the publication dates. On the screen, there were screenshots of 3 Facebook profiles, one in the name of Mary Santos, another as Anna Paulina Silva, and a third as Mary Fernandez. The photos never overlapped. When she posted as Mary in London, the other profiles remained silent. When it was Anna Paulina in Edinburgh, only that profile showed activity. That's how she kept the story coherent, Frederick realized. Each identity had its own digital narrative, friends who never met, places that never crossed paths. But look here, Charles pointed to a photo folder on one of the profiles. She has travel photos, and some of these photos appear on more than one profile, but with different captions and different people tagged. Frederick leaned in to see better. It was true. The same beach in Brighton Beach appeared on the London profile as charity trip to organise event, on the Edinburgh profile as personal retreat for renewal, and on the Bristol profile as work conference. Always the same sunset photo, but completely different contexts. She recycled experiences, Paul said, impressed against his will. One real trip became 3 different stories for 3 different audiences. It's brilliant in a disturbing way, Charles admitted. The level of planning, the attention to detail. If she had used that intelligence for something legitimate, she'd be CEO of some multinational, Frederick completed. But she chose this. At 2 in the morning, they finally had a complete plan. Roger had confirmed by message that Mary was returning to London on the 9 a.m. flight. She would arrive at her and Frederick's apartment around noon. The 3 men would be there waiting. What if she refuses to cooperate? Paul asked, concern evident in his voice. Then we show her the evidence and tell her we have 2 options, Frederick replied. Either she accepts our terms or we call the police immediately and let justice take its course. With the evidence we have, she has no way out. What about the money? Charles asked. How do we ensure she actually returns it? Roger is already working on that, Frederick explained. He has contacts in offshore banks. We can track her account and with the formal confession, we can block and transfer the funds. The money will go into a trust account that will be divided equally among the 5 children. Paul stood up and walked to the window looking at the dark street. Do you realize how surreal this is? Yesterday, each of us thought we had a normal marriage. Today we're here planning how to dismantle the life of a woman we didn't even know existed in the way she really does. I prefer to think we're planning how to protect 5 innocent children, Charles said softly, and how to protect ourselves too. She stole years of our lives, our trust, our money. She deserves to face the consequences, Frederick agreed. But Charles is right. Our focus is the children. Everything we do tomorrow has to be with them in mind first. Early in the morning, the 3 men hit the road back to London. The journey was quieter than the trip there. Each was lost in his own thoughts, processing not only the betrayal but also the strange brotherhood that had formed between them. They were united by shared pain, but also by a common purpose. They arrived in London at 11 o'clock. Frederick drove them directly to the apartment he shared with Mary, a spacious place in a luxury building in Kensington. The doorman greeted Frederick normally, without asking questions about the 2 men accompanying him. The apartment was silent when they entered. Frederick felt a wave of emotions as he crossed the threshold. How many times had he come home, kissed Mary, told her about his day, never imagining that she had other homes, other husbands, other completely separate lives. She should be here in about an hour, Frederick said, checking his phone. Let's get ready. Charles looked around the living room, noticing the details. Photos of Frederick and Mary together in elegant frames, books on social entrepreneurship on the shelves, a grand piano in the corner that Frederick explained Mary loved to play. At my house, she has a craft corner, Charles said. She said doing manual work relaxed her. Tapestries, paintings, ceramics, she spent hours there. At mine, it's gardening, Paul added. We have a huge garden that she cultivated with dedication, herbs, flowers, vegetables. She said being in contact with the earth kept her centered. Frederick sat on the sofa, the realization hitting with renewed force. She wasn't just 3 different women. She had 3 complete personalities, different hobbies, different interests, even different musical tastes. How does someone maintain that without going crazy? The diary, Charles said. We need to find that diary. They started searching. Frederick guided them through the rooms, checking drawers, cabinets, shelves. Charles found a small locked box in the closet, but Frederick didn't have the key. Paul suggested breaking it open, but Frederick hesitated. Let's wait for her to arrive, Frederick decided. We'll do this face to face. We want answers, not just evidence. At 12:15, they heard the key turning in the lock. The 3 men were sitting in the living room, positioned so that Mary would see them immediately upon entering. Frederick felt his heart race. Charles had his hands clenched into fists. Paul was visibly tense. The door opened. Mary entered. Pulling a small suitcase, her phone tucked between her shoulder and ear, laughing at something someone was saying. She was wearing a light blue dress, her hair tied in a loose ponytail. She looked radiant, relaxed, completely carefree. Then she saw the three men sitting in her living room. The phone slipped from her hand and fell to the floor with a dull thud. The color drained from her face. Her eyes went from Frederick to Charles to Paul, and Frederick saw the exact moment she realized it was over, her entire carefully constructed world crumbling in an instant. "Frederick," she began, her voice coming out in a strangled whisper. "What? What's happening?" "Sit down, Mary," Frederick said, his voice calm but firm. "Or should I call you Anna Paulina or Mary Paulina? It's hard to know which name to use when you have three different identities." Mary staggered, leaning against the wall. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, an explanation, anything. But there was no escape. Three men she had deceived were there together, knowing everything. "I can explain," she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Charles stood up, his voice sharp. "You cannot explain. There is no explanation that makes sense for what you did. 9 years of my life, Mary. 9 years believing you were my wife, that our daughters had a real family." 6 years, Paul added, also standing up. 6 years thinking I had found the right woman, that my son had a dedicated mother. Mary slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her knees bent against her chest. Tears began to stream down her face, but Frederick felt no pity. He had seen those tears for 11 years, in moments of joy and sadness, and now he wondered how many of them were real. "How did you do it?" Frederick asked. "How did you maintain 3 marriages, 3 families, 3 completely separate lives for so long?" Mary wiped her face with the back of her hand. When she looked at them again, something had changed in her expression. The mask of panic fell, revealing something colder, more calculating. "You want to know how?" she said, her voice now firm. "It was easy. You made it easy. 3 successful men too busy with your careers to ask difficult questions. 3 men who wanted a perfect wife and were willing to believe any story I told." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Frederick felt anger rise in his throat, but forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what they expected, the real Mary emerging now that the charade was over. "You know what's funnier?" Mary continued, a bitter laugh escaping. "I chose you carefully. Frederick, the pragmatic businessman who valued appearances and status. Charles, the romantic academic who wanted the dedicated educator. Paul, the young and ambitious engineer who needed domestic stability. Each of you received exactly what you wanted to see." "And the children?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. "My daughters were part of the plan too?" Something wavered in Mary's face. "The children. The children were real. They weren't part of any plan. I love my children." "Not enough to be honest with them," Paul said. "Not enough to give them a real life, built on truth instead of lies." Frederick stood up and walked to stand over Mary. "Here's what's going to happen now. You will give us access to the diary, where you write everything about your different lives. You will return every penny you stole from us. You will sign documents renouncing any rights to our assets, and you will leave our lives and the children's lives permanently." "What if I refuse?" Mary challenged. "Then we call the police now," Charles said. "We have enough evidence to put you in prison for years. Bigamy, fraud, embezzlement, and then it becomes a public scandal, and the 5 children grow up knowing their mother is in prison. Your choice." Mary looked at the 3 men, assessing her options. Frederick could see her mind working, looking for a loophole, a way to turn the situation around, but there was none. She was cornered, and she knew it. "How much time do I have?" she finally asked. 24 hours, Frederick replied. "We have an appointment at the registry office tomorrow at noon. You will sign everything in front of a notary, and your confession will be officially recorded. After that, you disappear." Mary closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was resignation in them. "All right, you win. I will cooperate, but—" She looked at each of them. "I want to say goodbye to the children. They deserve that." "No," the 3 men said in unison. "The children will be spared this for as long as possible," Frederick explained. "When they are old enough to understand, we will tell them the truth. But for now you will simply disappear from their lives. We will say you had to leave. that you won't be coming back. They will suffer, but it will be better than knowing the complete truth now." Mary nodded slowly, silent tears streaming down her face. This time, Frederick thought, perhaps they were real. The next morning arrived laden with palpable tension. Frederick had barely slept, mentally reviewing every detail of what would happen at the registry office. Charles and Paul had stayed at a nearby hotel, and the three met in the lobby at 10 in the morning. Roger was already there, a thick leather folder under his arm, containing all the necessary documents. "All ready," Roger said, his expression professional but with a hint of compassion in his eyes. "The notary is aware of the situation and has prepared all the papers, the formal confession, the terms of renunciation, the financial transfer documents. Everything she signs today will have full legal validity." "And her?" Paul asked. "Will Mary show up?" "I received a message from her an hour ago," Frederick said, showing his phone. "She said she'll be there." The registry office was in an old building in central London, with that classic architecture that still resisted time and modernization. They climbed the marble stairs to the third floor, each step seeming heavier than the last. The notary, Dr. Augustus Perry, was a man in his 60s, with perfectly combed grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses. "Gentlemen," he greeted them with a formal handshake. "The lady has already arrived. She's in the waiting room. I must say, in 35 years of my career, I've never seen a case like this." Mary was sitting in a high-backed chair, her hands clasped in her lap, looking out the window that overlooked the busy street. She was dressed simply, a plain grey dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun. She looked smaller somehow, as if she had shrunk overnight. When the three men entered, she stood up. Her eyes were red but dry. There were no more tears. "Shall we begin?" she said, her voice neutral and controlled. Dr. Augustus led them to a formal conference room. A long, dark wood table dominated the space, leather chairs arranged around it. He placed the documents on the table and began to explain each one. "First, we have the formal confession," he said, pointing to the document at the top of the pile. "Here the lady acknowledges having maintained 3 simultaneous marriages under different identities, having fathered 5 children with 3 different men, and having diverted funds from all 3 to a personal offshore account. This confession will be registered with the notary and may be used in future legal proceedings if necessary." Mary looked at the document, her eyes scanning the lines. Frederick observed her expression, looking for signs of regret, remorse, any human emotion, but her face remained an impenetrable mask. "Second," Dr. Augustus continued, "we have 3 documents of marital dissolution and renunciation of assets. The lady is renouncing any rights to properties, investments, or assets of Messrs. Frederick, Charles, and Paul. This includes alimony or any form of future financial support." "And the children?" Mary asked suddenly, her voice breaking for the first time. "Who will take care of them?" "Each father will retain full custody of their respective children," Charles replied. "The children will grow up knowing each other as siblings because that's what they are. But you will no longer have any contact with them." Mary closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Can I at least write letters? For when they're older, so they can understand?" Frederick exchanged glances with Charles and Paul. They hadn't discussed this possibility. After a moment, Frederick nodded slowly. "You can write a letter to each child," he said. "We will keep them and deliver them when they are adults, when they can process the information maturely. But that's all. No direct contact, no gifts, no attempt to insert yourself into their lives." Mary nodded, a single tear finally escaping. "Thank you. It's more than I deserve." "It is," Paul said simply. Dr. Augustus proceeded. "Third, we have the financial transfer document. The offshore account that the lady maintains, currently with a balance of £1,843,000, will be transferred to a trust account. The money will be divided equally among the 5 children and can only be accessed for education, health, and therapy expenses until each child reaches 25 years of age. And finally," he picked up the final document, "we have a non-contact and relocation agreement. The lady agrees to move abroad within 30 days and not to return to the UK for a minimum period of 10 years. She also agrees not to attempt contact with the gentleman or the children by any means. Mary looked at the papers spread before her. Her entire life, her choices, her lies, all summarized in cold, formal legal documents. Frederick almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Before I sign," Mary said, looking up, "can I say something?" "I don't know if we want to hear," Charles replied, but his voice no longer held the previous anger, just weariness. "Please," Mary insisted. "You deserve to understand why. It doesn't justify it, I know, but you deserve to understand." Frederick looked at Charles and Paul. Both nodded reluctantly. Dr. Augustus and Roger discreetly left the room, giving them privacy. Mary took a deep breath before starting. "I grew up in an orphanage in Birmingham. I never knew my parents. I moved from house to house, temporary family to temporary family. In each place I had to be a different person. The quiet girl for the family that wanted peace. The studious girl for the family that valued education. The helpful girl for the family that needed domestic help." She paused, her eyes distant as if seeing the past. "When I turned 18, I was thrown into the world alone, without family, without support, without a real identity. All I knew how to do was adapt, be what others needed me to be, and I discovered I was good at it, very good." "That doesn't explain the marriages, the children, the theft," Paul said, but his voice held less judgment now. "No, it doesn't explain," Mary agreed, "but when I met Frederick, I truly fell in love, or at least a part of me fell in love. But I realized that one part wasn't enough. I had so much love to give, so many versions of myself that wanted to be real, that wanted to have families, and I thought, why not? Why can't I be all these people I always had to pretend to be?" Frederick felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Not of the action, but of the wound that motivated it. "But the children," Charles began. "I love my children," Mary said with intensity. "Every one of them. They weren't tools or part of a plan. They were the only real thing in this whole construct. Every time I held a baby in my arms, every time I helped with homework, every birthday, every night reading stories before bed, all of that was real." "But built on lies," Paul said softly. "Yes," Mary admitted. "And that's why I'm signing these papers, because even if I love them, they deserve better than a mother who doesn't know who she really is." She picked up the pen Dr. Augustus had left and began to sign. Each signature was deliberate, careful. Frederick watched her hand move across the documents, sealing her own exile, renouncing the children she claimed to love, admitting crimes that could have put her in prison. When she finished, she pushed the documents to the center of the table. "Done, it's over." Dr. Augustus and Roger returned to the room. The notary checked each signature, stamped each document, made his own notes. "Everything is in order," he finally declared. "The documents are legally valid from this moment." Mary stood up, smoothing her dress. She looked at each of the three men, her gaze lingering on each face. "I know it doesn't make a difference now, but I'm sorry. Not for what I did to you, though I am, but for what I did to the children. They didn't deserve this." "No, they didn't," Frederick agreed, "but we will ensure they have the best possible future. Despite you, not because of you." Mary nodded, accepting the blow. She walked towards the door, but stopped at the threshold. "The letters," she said. "Can I have a week to write them? I want to do it right." "1 week," Charles agreed. "Send them to Frederick's office. He'll keep them safe." Mary left, and the sound of her footsteps echoing in the marble corridor gradually faded. The three men remained in silence for a long moment. "Is it over?" Paul finally asked. "The legal part?" "Yes," Roger replied. "The financial transfer will take a few days to process, but with the signed documents, it's only a matter of time." "And now?" Charles asked, looking at Frederick and Paul. Frederick sighed. "Now we go home, each to his city, to his children, and we begin the difficult work of rebuilding our lives." "What about the children?" Paul pressed. "How will we tell them?" "With time," Frederick said, "and with professional help. I've already contacted 3 excellent child psychologists, 1 for each child or set of children. They will guide us on the best way to approach this, according to each child's age. Charles agreed. And we need to stay in touch. The 5 are siblings even if they haven't grown up together. When they're older, they'll want to meet each other, build relationships. We have to facilitate that. Agreed, Paul said. Maybe we can organize meetings a few times a year. Start slow, let them get to know each other naturally. Frederick smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but of hope. You know, when I walked into that registry office 3 days ago to sign my divorce, I thought it was the end of everything. But maybe it's a beginning, a strange and painful beginning, but a beginning. They left the registry office together, descending the marble stairs side by side. Outside, London continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to the personal dramas unfolding in its old and modern buildings. People rushed to work, street vendors sold their wares, cars honked in the chaotic traffic. "You know what's strange?" Charles said as they walked down the pavement. "Yesterday I hated both of you. Not personally, but the idea of you. The other men who shared the woman I thought was only mine. Today, you are the only people in the world who truly understand what I'm going through." "It's a bizarre brotherhood," Paul agreed with a sad smile. The club of men who were married to the same woman without knowing it. Frederick laughed, an unexpected sound that surprised even himself. "We should make T-shirts." They stopped at a nearby cafe, ordering strong coffees and cheese bread. Sitting at a small table on the pavement, watching the city go by, they talked about the future, about how they would explain Mary's absences to the children, about therapy and education, about future gatherings where the 5 siblings could meet. "My daughters asked about their mother this morning," Charles shared. "I told them she had to travel for a long time, for an important job far from here. The older one asked when she would return. I didn't know what to answer. Luke asked the same thing," Paul said. "He said Mommy would miss him. I almost broke down right there." Frederick looked at his coffee, the dark surface reflecting the cloudy sky above. "Perhaps the only good thing that comes from this is that our children will grow up knowing the importance of honesty. They will learn eventually that lies, even well-constructed ones, eventually crumble. And when they crumble, they hurt more than the truth ever could." "It's an expensive lesson," Charles observed, "but important." They finished their coffees and stood up. On the pavement, the 3 men looked at each other. They weren't friends, not exactly, but they were something more. Survivors of the same storm, united by an experience no one else could truly comprehend. "I'm heading back to Edinburgh this afternoon," Charles said, "but we'll stay in touch, weekly messages, monthly calls. We need to be aligned on how to deal with the children." "Agreed," Paul said, "and we'll start planning those gatherings. Maybe in a few months when the dust settles a bit." Frederick nodded. "And if any of us needs help, with the children or with anything, the other 2 are a call away. We're all we have in this crazy situation." They exchanged a final handshake, and then each went their separate way. Frederick watched Charles and Paul disappear into the crowd, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The worst was over. Now began the long process of healing. On his way back home, Frederick stopped at a stationery store. He bought 5 beautiful notebooks, each a different color. In them he would begin to write the real story, the facts, the emotions. A diary for each child, documenting everything that happened honestly but compassionately. When they were adults, when they were ready, they would have not only their mother's letters but also their father's perspective. The complete truth, unfiltered by anger or resentment, but contextualized by love. 6 months had passed since that day at the registry office. Autumn had arrived in London, bringing cooler afternoons and a frequently cloudy sky that matched Frederick's mood. He was sitting in his office, not the corporate one on Oxford Street, but the home office he had set up in one of the apartment's spare rooms. The walls were covered with photos of the 5 children he had never met personally, but who were now part of his life, in an unexpected way. Mrs. Celia entered with a coffee tray, as she did every afternoon since Frederick had promoted her. She was no longer the cleaning employee, but his trusted personal assistant, the person who had saved not only his life, but the lives of 6 other people as well. "The letters have arrived," Mrs. Celia said softly, placing a thick envelope next to the coffee cup. "International mail from Ireland." Frederick picked up the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. 6 months, Mary had promised to send the letters in a week, but it had taken 6 months. Part of him had thought she would never send them. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside there were 5 separate letters, each in a smaller envelope with a child's name written in elegant cursive. Julia and Beatrice, Charles's daughters, Luke, Paul's son, and 2 letters without a specific recipient because the other 2 children were still babies when everything happened. Children Frederick hadn't even truly known. Along with the letters, there was a short note addressed to the 3 fathers, Frederick, Charles and Paul. It took me 6 months to write these letters because I wanted to do it right. I wrote and rewrote dozens of times, trying to find the words that could, somehow, make sense of what I did. I'm not sure I succeeded. These letters are for the children to read when they are adults, when they can understand without it destroying their childhoods. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect understanding. I only hope they know they were loved, even by the most flawed and broken person who ever existed. I am living in a small village in Ireland, working in a library. It's a simple, solitary life, but an honest one. For the first time in decades, I'm not pretending to be anyone other than myself, although I'm still not sure who that person really is. Thank you for protecting the children. You are better fathers than I ever was a mother. Mary. Frederick put the note aside and looked at the 5 smaller letters. He didn't open them. It wasn't his place. He would keep them along with the diaries he had started writing. Documents that one day would be given to 5 young adults who would need to understand the impossible story of their origins. His phone rang. It was a group video call that he, Charles and Paul had established as a monthly ritual. Frederick accepted the call and the faces of the other 2 men appeared on the screen. I received the letters, Frederick said without preamble. Me too, Charles confirmed. He was in his university office, bookshelves visible in the background. Haven't opened them yet. Neither have I, Paul added. He was at a construction site, wearing a hard hat and reflective vest. I think when it's time to give them to the children, we'll open them together. Make sure there's nothing harmful. Agreed, Frederick said, but this gives us time. Years, probably. Julia is only 8, Luke is 4. They won't be ready for this for a long time yet. Speaking of children, Charles said, a genuine smile appearing on his face. I have news. I talked to the girls about having siblings they don't know. I didn't go into detail, just said there are other children who are family to them. Julia was excited, asked when she could meet them. Luke, too, Paul said. When I showed him photos, he was fascinated. Said he always wanted siblings. I think he's ready for a meeting. Frederick felt something warm in his chest. Then let's organize it. A weekend somewhere neutral. Maybe a country house or a guest house in the countryside. Just us and the children. Start building those relationships. How about next month? Charles suggested. I have a recess at the university, and I know a perfect place in Cambridge. A family guest house, lots of space for the children to play. Works for me, Paul agreed. For me too, Frederick said. I'll make the reservations. After the call ended, Frederick looked at the screen for a long moment. 6 months ago, his world had crumbled. He had discovered that 11 years of his life had been based on lies, that the woman he loved didn't exist in the way he thought, that he shared this woman unknowingly with 2 other men. But from that disaster, something unexpected had emerged. A strange and untraditional family, yes, but a family nonetheless. 3 fathers who supported each other, 5 children who would soon know each other as siblings, and a support network built on honesty, something their previous lives had never had. Frederick picked up one of the colorful notebooks he had bought 6 months ago. This was the purple one, destined for Julia, the eldest. He had written in it weekly, documenting the events, his feelings, the decisions that were made and why. One day, when she was an adult, she could read and understand. He opened to a blank page and began to write about the letters that had arrived, about the plans for the meeting in Cambridge, about how life was beginning to find a new rhythm and purpose. His phone rang again. This time it was Richard, his lawyer and best friend. Frederick, I have news, Richard said. The financial transfer has been completed. The money is safe in the trust account. Each child has £368,000 guaranteed for education and their future. That's a relief, Frederick said. At least something good comes from all this. And there's more, Richard continued. Remember, you asked me to check if there were other victims. Other people Mary might have deceived before you? Frederick straightened up. And? Nothing. At least nothing we could find. It seems the three of you were the only ones. Whatever motivated her to do this, it started with you, Frederick. It was strange information to process. Part of him wondered if it would have been different if he had done something else, if he had seen the signs that were surely there. But another part knew that thought was useless. The past was immutable. Only the future could be shaped. A week later, Frederick was driving towards Cambridge, one of the colourful notebooks on the passenger seat. He had decided that this first meeting deserved its own detailed documentation. The children would want to know one day how they first met. The guest house was exactly as Charles had described, charming, welcoming, with a large garden where the children could play. Charles had already arrived with Julia and Beatrice. The girls were running on the lawn, chasing butterflies, their laughter echoing in the afternoon air. Paul arrived half an hour later with Luke, who immediately became shy upon seeing the older girls. But Julia, with the natural wisdom of an 8-year-old, took his hand and said, "Come on, you can be the prince and we'll be the princesses. We need to rescue a friendly dragon." And so, simply, the children began to get to know each other. They didn't know yet that they were siblings. For them, they were just new friends their fathers had introduced. But the three men, sitting in wooden chairs on the veranda, watching the children play, knew they were witnessing the beginning of something important. "They're going to be close," Charles said softly. "I can feel it." "I hope so," Paul agreed. "They'll need each other when they know the truth." Frederick watched Julia teach Luke how to do a somersault on the grass, Beatrice applauding when he succeeded. "You know, I spent 6 months angry. Angry at Mary, angry at myself for being deceived, angry at the universe for allowing something like this to happen. But looking at them now..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think I'm starting to feel something different. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but acceptance, perhaps, and gratitude." "Gratitude?" Charles asked, surprised. "For the children," Frederick explained. "If all this hadn't happened, they wouldn't exist. And despite everything, despite the lies and the pain, they are innocent and wonderful. And now they will have not only one father, but 3 men who care about their well-being. Not just siblings, but a support network that most children never have." Paul nodded slowly. "Turning the mess into something good. I like that." That night, after the children had gone to sleep, the 3 men stayed up on the veranda, drinking coffee and talking. They spoke about their jobs, their future plans, about how each was coping with the therapy they had all started. "My therapist said something interesting," Charles shared. "She said that betrayal on a normal scale is already difficult to process, but what happened to us is so extreme, so out of the ordinary, that our brains are still trying to categorize it. That's why it sometimes feels surreal. Mine said it's important not to let this define our future lives," Paul added. "That we can choose to see this as a tragedy or as a transformative experience. The choice is ours." Frederick thought about it. "I think it can be both. It can be the worst thing that has ever happened to us, and also the catalyst for us to become better people, better fathers." "Are you going to try again?" Charles asked suddenly. "Relationships, I mean, eventually." Frederick shrugged. "I don't know. The idea of trusting someone like that again. It's terrifying, but I also don't want to live the rest of my life alone and afraid. And you?" "I'm not ready yet," Paul admitted, "but maybe one day, when the wounds aren't so fresh." "Time heals," Charles said. "At least that's what everyone says. I hope they're right." The weekend passed quickly. The children played, ate together, took photos that one day would be part of the notebooks Frederick kept. On the last day, when it was time to leave, Julia hugged Luke and Beatrice and said, "Can we do this again? I liked having new friends." "Absolutely," Frederick promised. "We'll do this many times." Back in London, Frederick found Mrs. Celia in his office, organizing papers. She looked at him and smiled. "How was it?" "It was good," Frederick said, and realized it was true. "It was really good." "I'm proud of you, sir," Mrs. Celia said, "of what the 3 of you did. You could have let anger control you, made choices that hurt the children, But you chose the harder path, the right path. Frederick sat behind his desk. You saved us all, Celia. If you hadn't brought that evidence that day, I would have signed the papers. Mary would have disappeared with the money. And who knows how many other people she would have deceived afterwards. I just did what any decent person would do, Mrs. Celia said modestly. No, Frederick corrected. Most people would have kept quiet, thought it wasn't their business. You risked your savings, your time, possibly your job. You did it because it was right, not because it was easy. That's heroism, Celia. Real heroism. Mrs. Celia blushed, but her eyes shone with tears of gratitude. That night, Frederick opened his laptop and began to write an email to Charles and Paul. He had thought a lot about the future, about how they wanted things to evolve. Subject: proposal for the future. Charles and Paul, I've been thinking a lot since the weekend in Cambridge. Seeing the children together, happy, innocent, made me realize that we have a unique opportunity here. Not just to remedy a terrible situation, but to create something genuinely special. I propose that we formalize our arrangement. Not legally, but through a personal commitment between the three of us. I want to propose that we commit to the following. 1. Quarterly meetings with all the children, so that they grow up knowing each other and forming bonds. 2. Weekly communication between the three of us, keeping everyone informed about the children's well-being. 3. Mutual financial support if any of us faces difficulties. The money in the trust account is for the children, but we can create our own collective emergency fund. 4. When the time comes to tell the children the truth, we will do it together, with professional support, so that they feel loved and protected above all else. 5. Guarantee that each child will have access not only to their own father, but to all three, as supportive paternal figures. Honorary uncles, if you prefer to think of it that way. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think we can turn this tragedy into something beautiful. An untraditional family, but a real family nonetheless. Think about it and let me know what you think. With respect and brotherhood, Frederick. The replies arrived the next morning. First, Charles. I completely agree. Let's do this. Then Paul. Yes, 100% yes. Let's build something good out of this. Frederick smiled as he read the replies. He closed his laptop and picked up Julia's purple notebook again. He had one last entry to make about the weekend, about the proposal he made and the responses he received. As he wrote, he thought of Mary, alone in a village in Ireland, living a simple life for the first time. He didn't forgive her. Perhaps he never would. But he no longer felt anger. He felt only a distant sadness for a woman who was so lost in her own lies that she destroyed multiple lives trying to find a real identity. But from the destruction, they had built something new. Not perfect, not traditional, but real and honest. 5 children who would grow up knowing they were loved, that they had a support network, that they had siblings. 3 men who had learned that strength comes not from revenge, but from choosing to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Frederick finished writing and closed the notebook. He looked out the window at the city of London, always in motion, always reinventing itself, as he was doing, as they all were doing. Life had given him an impossible twist, a story no one would believe if he told it. But he had chosen not to be defined by the betrayal, but by how he responded to it. He had chosen dignity over anger, the protection of the innocent over the punishment of the guilty, the future over the past. And in that, finally, there was peace. If Frederick, Charles, and Paul's journey touched your heart, if you felt the pain of betrayal and the beauty of rebuilding, know that we have many other emotional stories waiting for you. Stories about love, overcoming challenges, family, and the strength of the human spirit. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Leave a like if this narrative made you reflect on honesty, family, and forgiveness. And in the comments tell us, would you have made the same choices as Frederick? Charles and Paul, how would you deal with such an impossible situation? Your opinion is important to us until the next story.